What if Warrant went industrial? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every week I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I take a different popular song and try to imagine an alternative universe in which a change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week, as per a viewer request, was Cherry Pie by Warrant, and I attempted to turn that into a 90s style industrial rock song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. So I must admit, I'd mainly missed Warrant at the time that they were sort of at their commercial peak. I did used to read the metal magazines Raw and Metal Hammer and Kerrang, so I'd definitely seen their name around and obviously heard Cherry Pie when it came out, but I guess by the time they were hitting that peak, I was already starting to get into slightly heavier stuff, edging towards thrash metal rather than glam metal, hair metal kind of stuff, so I wasn't paying that much attention. And it's only really in sort of the years afterwards that I've heard odd other bits of what they did and learned a little bit more of their story. Their debut album came out in 1989, that was Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinking Rich, and that was a really big success and kind of placed them at the forefront of that whole glam metal thing. There were a bunch of hit singles from it. I think the only one I can ever really remember is Down Boys, which is a bit of a tune, and there's a great clip of them from an MTV show back in the day performing it with just these absolutely outrageously ridiculous synchronized dance moves. It just cracks me up completely. Obviously that was a big success, so they just wanted to capitalize on that, went straight to work on another record, and they pretty much got the second album done, played it to the label, and the label was just, yeah, we don't hear the big hit single, demanded that they go away and write something along the lines of Love in an Elevator by Aerosmith, which had just been a pretty massive hit. So that's what Cherry Pie is. That's them going away and knocking out a bump and grind song with suggestive lyrics in about 15 minutes to meet this label demand. And then obviously the label loved it and decided they were going to rename the album after the single, and kind of feel sorry for the band about it because they ended up saddled with this song that they weren't particularly impressed with themselves, and it became their signature and they had to play it every single time they played anywhere. I mean, I've never been a massive fan of the song. It's got, as I say, that bump and grind feel that characterises Love in an Elevator, also Def Leppard's Pour Some Sugar on Me. It does a pretty good job of that. The lyrics are pretty gross, kind of misogynist, doesn't really bear close examination, but I felt a bit better actually knowing that the band themselves weren't particularly happy with it either. So I've kind of covered this era a lot in previous videos in this series, but it was bad luck for Warrant really that they were just coming to their commercial peak at the exact point that grunge was about to arrive and just kind of wipe out the genre that they'd put themselves at the forefront of. And like all their peers, they had to figure out what they were going to do to react to this sudden sea change in rock music. I think initially, kind of like Skid Row did, they tried to just stand their ground to a certain extent, didn't completely change what they were doing, but just toughened up a little bit, maybe toned down the glammier edges, the poppier edges of their sound, and just delivered a really kind of strong hard rock album, which was the Dog Eat Dog album. And I think their sort of hardcore fans really appreciated that, and I seem to recall they got pretty good critical write-ups as well, but just didn't shift anywhere near as many units as the previous couple of albums had done. So they obviously needed to do something different, and that's when belatedly they really lean into the grunge thing. So there's a couple of albums after that where they were desperately trying to insert themselves into this grunge idiom that had already been going for a little while there. And by the time they get into it, that sound's already a little bit played out. And I think their longtime fans obviously weren't too impressed with them suddenly changing direction. People who are already into grunge, I'm sure, saw it as being pretty insincere and pretty inauthentic, so it just never really kind of worked for them, sadly. But, you know, all credit to them. They've kept soldiering on one way or another, lots of lineup changes, but they've somehow stuck at it. Sadly, Janie Lane, the lead singer, who also wrote Cherry Pie and many of their other biggest songs, passed away a few years ago, but there's still some version of Warrant kicking around to this day. I'm sure they're still doing pretty well, so good on them, really. I think any band of that generation that managed to deal with the onslaught of the alternative rock revolution and somehow come out the other side in whatever shape, I think they've done pretty well. But yeah, it was interesting to me that their route through the 90s was to attempt to assimilate into the grunge thing, because I mean there were plenty of other bands who tried to do a similar thing with pretty similarly disappointing results. The other option that some of their other peers took, some other people who'd come up through earlier styles of rock music into the 90s, was to adopt some new technology, change up their look a bit, and go industrial. And you did see that with a few folk in the 90s, including some of the proper old guard of heavy rock. I mean, in the wake of Marilyn Manson, you saw Alice Cooper trying his hand at industrial for a little bit there. And Rob Halford of Judas Priest, when he left the band for a while, dived headlong into that as well, really embraced that kind of more technological approach. So yeah, it's an interesting question that the viewer who requested this one posed. If Warrant had just chosen that other route, how would that have turned out? I've never been a massive fan of industrial music in any of its particular offshoots. I think the closest I've ever come was Big Black, who definitely had a bit of an industrial punk sound, but I mainly consider them to be part of that Chicago punk scene at the time, kind of alongside Naked Raygun, with whom they shared members and all that stuff. But it's a pretty massive scene with many offshoots, so if you're not familiar with the whole history of it, it's probably good to just go back over some of that right now. I guess industrial initially emerged kind of parallel to punk rock, and those initial industrial bands, Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, SPK, those kind of guys, they kind of existed in a space somewhere between popular music and kind of avant-garde art, really. So it's a blend of the kind of synthesized music that people like Kraftwerk have been doing, the sort of experimental electronic music that avant-garde composers had been coming up with through the latter 20th century, people like Edgar Varese and Karlheinz Stockhausen, and then the confrontational aspects of punk rock. So there's a lot of taboo lyrical subject matter, subversive, transgressive stuff going on, songs about serial killers and tragedies and just things that no one would ever want to write a pop song about, edgy things that were specifically designed to push people's buttons. Those early industrial records are generally really harsh, sparse, synthesized noise, vocals often heavily distorted, use of tape loops to create this really challenging kind of alien, harsh sounding music, which in some instances people would question whether it could even be called music. It gathers momentum, and throughout the 80s you see more and more people getting interested in this, more and more people taking the basic building blocks of industrial and hybridizing it with other things. So there are people who are combining elements of this with sort of ambient music, the kind of stuff that people like Brian Eno had been pioneering in the 70s. You get people blending elements of this harsh industrial sound with synth pop to create new strands of electronica. And you also get people combining this sort of electronic industrial sound with rock music. And that's kind of the strand of it that we're following, obviously going through the 80s with people like Big Black, who I already mentioned, who combined really sort of harsh, aggressive punk with drum machine rhythms and samples. Einstürzende Neubauten, who again had some rock instrumentation but mixed it in with electronic sounds and sort of amplified actual industrial sound, like people shoveling coal onto metal chutes they'd amplify, or even I think on one record they have one of the band members' rib cages mic'd up and that they do the percussion by punching them in the chest, that kind of thing. So still pretty extreme stuff, but then as the 80s wear on, this hybridization continues. Towards the end of the 80s, you start to get bands emerging like Nine Inch Nails and Ministry, who still have some pretty harsh sounds going on, still sounds pretty edgy, but at the same time, it's a bit more of a palatable mix of these synthesized and noisy elements with rock music that takes in bits of punk, bits of goth, bits of heavy metal. And between like Ministry's The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste and Nine Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine albums, they really start to gather some commercial momentum. So into the 90s, when the grunge revolution's happening, there's a sort of parallel rise of this sort of industrial rock going on. And that goes on to become one of the major movements in rock throughout the 90s. When you think of it, obviously Nine Inch Nails continue to get massive. White Zombie start to take in some of these industrial sounds and have a couple of massive hit albums. Marilyn Manson combines a Nine Inch Nails-ish industrial rock sound with some of the theatrics of people like Wasp or Alice Cooper to create an arena-filling phenomenon. Rammstein, again, taking the sort of harsh Germanic industrial sound of Einstürzen und Neubauten and just turning it into a more commercially palatable arena-filling phenomenon again. So yeah, it's remarkable really how a genre that started off as one of the most deliberately anti-commercial, almost sort of self-consciously repellent artistic statements somehow over the course of just over a decade really managed to morph into this movement that became a literally stadium-filling phenomenon. So my alternative universe scenario for this week is just that we go back to the end of the 80s. Warrant is still pretty high on the success of that first album. The label's pressuring them for a follow-up, so they're working on stuff for that. And at the same time, just playing some club dates to keep their hand in, keep their public profile up. And on one of these club dates, they get booked with a support act that turns out to be a young Nine Inch Nails who've just obviously done the Pretty Hate Machine album. Warrant are astonished to see that as the venue's filling up, this upstart band have got, if anything, more fans in attendance than they have, and their fans are younger and edgier and seem kind of mocking of the slightly older crew who've come out to see Warrant. Their concern deepens when they actually see Nine Inch Nails and just hear this astonishing music that sounds like the future and just seems to blow everything they've been doing out of the water. So they're shaken to the point where they have to go back to the studio and rework all these songs they've been doing, you know, stripping out layers of more traditional rock sounds and adding in sequencers and samples to turn it into something that sounds modern and industrial. And so they finish that up and take it to the label, but the label have just been counting on them turning in something else that sounds like Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinking Rich Part 2, and they're so disgusted with it they just drop Warrant on the spot. So our heroes are really upset with this and at a bit of a low ebb, but luckily a cassette copy that they've made of the unreleased album has somehow managed to find its way into the hands of Al Jurgensen from the Ministry, and he's really impressed to the point where he uses his leverage in the business to influence Wax Trax, the legendary Chicago industrial label, to sign Warrant up, and off the back of that they get the album out, they get added to the lineup of the inaugural Lollapalooza tour, and that just places him at the forefront of alternative rock going into the 90s, which, you know, would have been a very nice outcome for them had it happened. So in trying to take Cherry Pie and turn it into this industrial song, as ever, my first step is just taking the lead vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and syncing it up. I sped it up a little bit because obviously the original track's got that slow sort of bump and grind kind of feel to it. I wanted a bit more of a high energy electronic thing, so sped that up quite a lot. I then added some drum machines, added two different drum machines, different elements of a couple of different drum machines, just to create a slightly dancey, four on the floor thudding electronic underpinning throughout the whole track, and then added some acoustic sounding drums over that as well. So we've got that mixture of the two, because I think one of the things that characterizes a lot of that industrial rock of the 90s is this sort of blurring of lines between organic sounds, electronic sounds. been conscious of trying to make the organic sounds a bit processed so they're edging into the electronic territory, and the electronic sounds kind of distorted and grubby, so there's a bit of a blurring of lines there. With that in mind, added some synth bass. There's a couple of different things on there. There's sort of arpeggiated synth bass that underpins everything, and then a couple of other synth bass sounds that are taking the place of quite a few of the guitar riffs from the original. And then there's more of a kind of floaty pad that just creeps in over the top there, just adding a bit more atmosphere too. Then added a couple of guitars, as I say, processed them quite heavily so they sound a bit less organic than, you know, your standard hard rock guitars. And there's also a bass on there which is really distorted, just kind of this evil, sputtering, kind of fuzzy bass sound in there as well. I also processed the vocals quite a bit, again, just to give them an almost machine-like quality. So I've split the vocal into a few sections. So some of them, it's just got a fuzz tone on, just to make it a bit gnarly and edgy sounding. And then some of them, as well as the fuzz, we've got a phaser on there, which makes it sound really quite trippy and quite inhuman, which I thought was quite a nice industrial touch. And then, obviously, the use of samples was quite a big thing in a lot of this 90s industrial music, so I figured I should get at least one sample in there. I picked up on the lyric that crops up in the bridge section of the song, which is, "I scream, you scream, we all scream." So I thought, okay, well, we'll sample a scream. So I picked the most famous scream in all of film history, the Wilhelm scream, which is just in countless films. Sampled that and then just pitched it to fit the song, so it sounds like a female scream, actually it's a guy, and that just kind of crops up as a rhythmic element in various parts of the song too. And then for the video, obviously started off as ever by just finding some good performance footage from back in the day of Warrant doing that. Synced that up, so I had to speed it up quite a lot to sync it up with my track. When I think of 90s industrial music, I think maybe just because of the way it's used in films, it always makes me think of sort of gloomy, edgy, European kind of nightclubs. I don't know if it's just a scene from Blade I'm thinking of, but I always just imagine kind of vampires in a nightclub when I hear that kind of music. So I was looking for some footage that just captured a bit of that feel. Found some footage of this kind of industrial goth nightclub in Berlin somewhere, and that really fit the bill, so synced some of that in there as well. And then I've just got a bunch of my usual mocked up concert posters and flyers, just placing Warrant in that kind of 90s industrial context as well, just to give it a bit more of that atmosphere as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not sure how good a job I did of turning it into an industrial song. As I say, it's a little bit out of my usual wheelhouse, but I had loads of fun trying to turn it into that, so I hope you had fun listening to it as well. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe as well. That always helps a lot. Also, if there's anything else you'd like me to try, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, or any songs you'd like me to do something with, do let me know. I always appreciate your suggestions. But otherwise, that's it from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.